And at 3:31, we will get started. I'm gonna spotlight you. Okay. Do you want to go into slideshow mode?
Sure.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited about the interest in this workshop, and I think it's useful for many different disciplines as well as levels of education / position, whether you're a graduate student, a postdoctoral fellow, or a faculty member. This type of workshop really lends insight into what journals and editors are looking for in the manuscripts that we submit. And I'm very honored today that Nidhi Bansal has joined us. Nidhi is the editor-in-chief of Cancer Reports and the developmental editor of Current Reports, and these are Wiley journals. So Nidhi will tell us a little bit about her own background and how she has gotten to this position, but we're very grateful that she's spent a lot of time preparing this presentation for us today. We hope it's interactive. Please feel free to type questions into the chat and I will ask them, and we'll keep this conversation going because this is really just the beginning of our learning how to be better at publishing and submitting our data so that the rest of the world can benefit from our wonderful research here at Rutgers. So Nidhi, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nidhi Bansal. I'm a scientific editor, as Janet mentioned, at Wiley, managing 2 journals, Cancer Reports and Current Protocols. I have been in publishing since 4 years now, and before that, I was on the other side. I was a researcher. I was a cancer biologist by training, completed my PhD in India, and then moved on to the United States for my postdoctoral training at Wake Forest University and Mount Sinai before joining Wiley. So that's a short summary of how I transitioned from academia to publishing. But here today, I am more here in a capacity as an editor and to share my opinion and my thoughts on how to write a manuscript that reviewers and editors will like.
Can you just go into full screen mode? We still see the.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because it's in the presentation mode on my side. Let me see. So you don't see the presentation mode?
No, we see all your slides on the left.
Let me see if I just want to share again in the presentation mode. Does this give you the full slide?
That's better. Yep, we see the whole slide.
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
So I was not aware you're supposed to share twice, one in the presentation mode, and that's a different. Okay. So all fixed. So just a brief overview of what we can expect in the next 90 minutes or so. We will go, before we actually deep dive into what goes into a manuscript preparation, I thought it'll be a good exercise to go over what really the scientific publishing process as a process looks like, the journal selection process, and a sneak preview of the peer review process before moving on into the tips and best practices in manuscript writing. We will touch a bit upon open data and open publishing practices that are now influencing manuscript preparation and publication decisions. And if time permits, I just wanted to briefly talk about a new article type that is geared towards promoting transparency and scientific rigor, registered reports. So we'll see how it goes. We'll have a few poll questions. which I hope most of you will participate in, and a short 5 to 7 minutes activity. Please feel free, as Jad had mentioned, to post your questions in the chat box or whichever way you're most comfortable with. So let's move on into the actual content for the presentation. Scientific publishing. So here you can see a word cloud, which is full of terms that are now taking over and influencing the publishing industry. So they are current trends, sometimes disruptions, and sometimes innovations that are influencing scientific research and scholarly communication. And the ones that most of you may have already been familiar with is open access, open science, funding decisions that are being influenced by both rigor, reproducibility, transparency, preprints, and article metrics. We won't be able to go through, obviously, all these trends in this presentation, but we will be mostly touching upon how open science, reproducibility, and transparency are influencing the manuscript preparation and publication process. This, of course, I'm very sure most of you are familiar with, is the traditional publication process. 3 phases. There's manuscript preparation, journal submission, then the evaluation process, which is more like a black box as to how the editors and the reviewers evaluate your paper, followed by publication and the recently trending. You're not done once you're publishing your paper. You have to also promote your research, which is now being actively done through social media, including promotion as well as sometimes retractions. So all of these things are now the trending things under dissemination, which is now promoted both by the authors themselves as well as publishers. Before we go through anything else, I think choosing a journal should never be the last step in manuscript preparation or in manuscript submission. It should, I think, be one of the very first things in the process of, as you're doing your research, identifying and choosing journals that you think would be best candidates for your paper. So finding the right journal for your paper should be fairly thought about fairly early in your journey of publishing your manuscript. And the reasons for this will become more apparent as we progress through our presentation. But at this point, I would like to just briefly pause and probably take your opinion on, when you want to publish your paper, how will you choose your journal? What is the most important factor for you when you're choosing a journal for your paper?
I launched a poll, so please select what is your criteria when you're choosing a journal. What's the most important to you? Ooh, the votes are going up. 75% of the people have voted. 82%. I'll give it 10 more seconds. The suspense. Okay. Just a few more seconds and then I will share the results. 90% have voted. Yay. Better than the national election. Okay. I will share the results.
Impressive. I'm actually very impressed. I was expecting impact factor will win. And I am really impressed that it's the scope and readership of the journal that is the winner, and followed by impact factor. Excellent. And I'm a little disappointed that speed of publication has not really picked up more than it should have, but of course that's the result. So
Why do you,
So,
I'm just curious, why do you think speed of publication should be a criteria?
well, if you think about it, within this fast-paced research environment, you would also like to get your research out fast. And that is why I think preprints are picking up, because people want to see their research, which they have done in 1 or 2 years and perhaps even more, get out much faster so that they can get more feedback and build upon it moving forward as to what is important, as opposed to waiting for something that they have been doing for the past 5 years and waiting for an additional year for it to be published. When finally it does, you might just get exhausted and to never like sort of build upon it. So I think with the rapidly, and then also in terms of the career movement, right? You would expect that you would like to publish faster and progress into the next phase of whatever you want to do. So for n number of reasons, grants, career, as well as just in the interest of progressing science and advancing science, I just thought that speed of publication should also be important.
There are a bunch of comments in the chat about how if they could have chosen more than one answer, they would have chosen speed of publication. And then there's a comment about negative connotation. Do you think there's any downside to quick publications? Does it sort of taint the publication itself? I guess.
If a journal is publishing fast, and so should the journals be blacklisted for doing a good job? So these are two separate things. I think what is important is the peer review process. And there are number of factors. Just because a journal is publishing a paper in 6 months doesn't necessarily qualify it to be a rigorous peer review process. There are n number of factors that we will go through in the next slides that can cause delays and therefore the publication time. The principal ones, them being the time it takes for an editor to reach to your paper and make a decision, and the time it takes to find a reviewer and then the reviewers to return the reports. So and then depending upon the journal model, if you have external editors, they have their own research responsibility. So delays in publication time should never be equated to the quality of peer review. So that will be my answer. So definitely, please don't punish us for publishing your paper faster, as long as you are convinced with a thorough peer review process. I think the only time red flags should be raised is when you receive reviewer reports that doesn't sound like a reviewer report, or you don't receive anything. You just receive like, congratulations, your paper has been accepted. That's a red flag. So moving forward, as someone mentioned, one criteria alone may not be the deciding factor for how to choose a journal. And usually it's a combination of scope, impact, audience, publication time, and recently also on the preprint policies for the journal. Many of us are posting our research on preprint, so we want to make sure that the journal we want to target is not considering preprint as novelty tainted. So we want to make sure that we know that the journal's preprint policies, a lot of funders are now mandating archiving your research, so self-archiving policy. So all these are nuances that are now influencing an author's decision to select journals, and also motivating editors to leave their conventional ways and sort of progress and move with the world. So, but above all, I think one more factor goes in when you are choosing a journal. Don't judge only the journal, also judge your own research. It's absolutely important to be fair and unbiased critical reviewer of your own work and realize what are your priorities and limitations, and then find the right match. And the reasons I say this, that while one-off, it might seem that you might be limiting your scope of getting it published in a much higher impact factor. It will also help you in get a faster publication time. So I think being an honest reviewer for your own work, seeking honest opinion from your colleagues is also very important in making this decision of which journal to choose from. So once we have chosen the journal, often many authors neglect the journal guidelines until it's like 10 days before you're ready to submit your paper. This is something that should not be done, and it's a sincere editor's plea to always read your journal guidelines fairly early in your process of manuscript preparation and publication process. And the reason is not just because you want to be aware of the templates that a journal may have, not just because you want to know the formats that the journal requires. Sure, that is important. But more importantly, it is also to know what are the best practices in the field. More often than not, the journals, they stay updated with reporting standards that have been instituted by funders, that have been instituted by publishers themselves, as well as the reporting standards that are now being adopted in the community. So it is a good starting point to, when you are preparing your manuscript, to also go through the guidelines of your candidate journals, especially to find out what are the best practices in the field, what are the reporting standards, what are the data sharing requirements, and so on and so forth. And this, as I've mentioned, like a referee, be your own reviewer. Another thing which is very important and you should be aware of fairly early in your research process is the ethical guidelines. And again, the journal guidelines are a good place to start with. You want to know what is the recent ethical compliance requirements for good journals. And the reason why I say it's important to know early on, especially when it comes to ethical approvals, you cannot trace them back, right? You need to get these in order, the approvals, as you're designing your experiments. So it is very important for you to know what is required of you, and journal guidelines are a good place to start with. Over and above, there are other ethical guidelines that circle around plagiarism, data duplication, figure manipulation, etc., that are good red flags and good alerts to be aware of as you're preparing a manuscript. And last is the cover letter, which is still important for many journals. And it is always nice to know whether the journal that you are targeting for, what are its priorities, how does it evaluate its papers.
Nidhi, we just have a quick question. What does green OA versus gold OA mean?
Sure. So green OA is, so open access is essentially a general term used when a paper is in front of a paywall. So you don't need to pay anything to get access to its content. Under open access, you have two types: green open access and gold open access. Gold open access is when the authors, upon acceptance of their paper, they pay an article publication charge and thereby bring their paper in front of the paywall. So they are upfront paying an article publication charge so that the manuscript upon publication is freely available and accessible to one and all, irrespective of the subscription status of the journal and the institution that's subscribed to. Now, in the gold open access, some journals are purely gold open access journals, which means they don't have subscription models. They only publish OA articles, so they charge an APC. Example is PLOS ONE, for instance, Cancer Reports that I added, and those are the examples. Other journals, of course, have both versions available. They're called hybrid journals that, for example, AACR journals, Journal of Neuroscience Research, all these authors by convention, their papers are not open access. Someone is accepted. The access will only be granted to someone who has an institution or a personal subscription to the journal, unless and until an author pays an APC and makes it open access. Green open access, on the other hand, is when the paper becomes freely available after an embargo period. So there is no publication charges at all. Your paper is getting accepted. It's behind the paywall. It is accessible only to someone who has a journal subscription. However, under Green Open Access, there is an embargo period typically of 6 to 12 months, after which the paper becomes available. So papers available through PubMed Central are usually under Green Open Access, and that is the NIH mandate that your papers should be under Green Open Access. Okay. The next...
So somebody's annotating. Somebody's annotating the slides, so I'm gonna erase that. Keep going though.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it's sort of not translating and somehow writing as typing as well. So, all right. So once a journal is selected, what really happens when your manuscript is submitted? The very first step is the quality control. And this again emphasizes my previous point that it is a good starting point to know the journal guidelines. If you have read the journal guidelines, this step should not be a problem, because usually quality control means they'll check the essential things that a journal requires of you. The files are present, graphical abstract, for instance, is a requirement if that's present, format requirements, abstracts, what else, figure qualities, and so on and so forth. So the basic housekeeping elements of a journal that are being done at this stage. And then the next stage, of course, is the editorial evaluation. If that goes well, again, this is a very macroscopic evaluation where they are just seeing whether the paper is in scope with the journal's vision. And again, if you've done your homework of going through the journal's guidelines, these first two steps should be fairly easy to pass, unless there are some major flaws with your experiments and your results. Then next is, of course, the classical reviewer selection, which the editors seek, and the peer review process. And these two stages, the reviewer selection and the peer review process, is the bottleneck of the publication time. And that is why I mentioned previously that if a journal is doing this fast, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad journal. It just means that they are devoting maybe more resources and are being more aggressive in seeking reviews, not that they are compromising the peer review quality. Then of course, after this is the final decision process of editorial decisions, something that I think all of us are traditionally aware of. So this is nothing new. Nothing has changed, at least in this process, if you're just going the traditional way.
Sorry, so, I have another question, if you don't mind, that's out there. So you were talking about having all of the policies that, have been followed properly, all the protocols, all the requirements have been tested. So Matt's asking, is it the role of the journal to determine the requirements, say on the IRB or the IACOC side? For example, if a study does a survey and the authors say they don't need an IRB, is the journal to police this, or does it just trust the institute to have done this?
We don't police it. We are placing the policies to make sure that the research has gone through proper channel to be completed. And here it's mostly on the system works on honor system still, much like if you are taking a vaccine in New Jersey, it's like honor system that you're saying you're eligible, you are eligible. It pretty much is the same thing, where if you are saying that you had consulted it with your IRB and it was waived, knowing, for example, all the patient information has been anonymized, and that is why your institutional review board considered there's no patient consent requirement is essentially waived, the editors will take that on trust basis. And that is why when they're dealt with is pretty much if someone alerts the editor that they say that the ethical statement, for example, was approved where it was not, and that is where expression of concerns and investigations are then started even there, it's the editorial board that reaches out to the institute to first do the investigation. So it's mostly the policing part is mostly the institutes, and also to some extent the funding agencies. But other than that, the editors, the journals mostly want to make sure that the authors are alerted that this is required. And same explanation goes for conflicts of interest. If an author says, I have no conflict of interest, we are not going to hunt them down to find a company that they are associated with and they did not declare it to us until someone says that they should have and they have not. And then even then, we just open the investigations for the institutes. So when we are going for broad assessment by the editor, again, this is, as you can see, it's a bird's view really, where an editor at first pass is just looking at the scope, the format, the understandability, and the ethical compliance of this paper. And again, should be fairly easy to cross if you have been diligent enough in choosing the right journal and reading the guidelines. The difference then comes at the next step, depending upon what journal you have chosen. And it's very important to understand that there are now two categories of journals: sound science journals and selective journals. Sound science journals mostly concern themselves with the science. They are not concerned with the novelty factor, the X factor, or how someone perceives a study to be impactful. But they are definitely concerned themselves with the hypothesis, whether there is a logic as to why the study was done, the technical and scientific rigor behind that study, and the conclusions. Are they accurate? Are they supported by data? Even if that means the study was negative, even if that means the study did not produce the desired effect it was set out to explore. So these are sound science journals and are often mistaken with bad science journals, which is not necessarily true. So there are a lot of myths, misconceptions about sound science journals, mistaking them for poor review quality, mistaking them as open access journals, so necessarily like a bad science journal. So a topic for some other presentation, not today, but just wanted to comment on that. So the editors of the sound science journals, in addition to the scope format, they look at the scientific rigor and the technical rigor, ethical compliance. Selective journals, on the other hand, in addition to looking to all this, actually on top of looking at all this, they first look at the novelty of the study. They look at the importance and the interest. The last two particularly are labeled under perceived impact. How the editor perceives the importance and impact of that study, whether the editor thinks that it is an advancement in the field, whether it would be a breakthrough finding in the field. So these are the broad assessment criteria that are used by an editor, and depending upon it's a sound science or selective journal, the criteria can vary, can differ quite considerably. And the top reasons at this level, the editorial triage, the most of the top reasons that a paper gets rejected, which we call desk rejects, is when the manuscript does not fall within the aims and scopes. This is simply poor research work done by the authors, that they did not choose the right journal. There is a lack of clear hypothesis or research aim. And this is what exactly we'll go through in the latter half of our presentation, how we need to bring out the aim and the hypothesis in the abstract as well as in the introduction part of the paper, of the manuscript writing. Of course, if there are glaring flaws in the procedures, so that's a no-brainer, it will get rejected. Poor language, and this is something, this is not just incorrect English, it also concerns, it also covers bad structure and bad logical flow of experiments. So if there is no structure, there is no flow in the manuscript, and on top of that, the language is also poor, no matter how good your results may be, sadly, they will be rejected. Most unscientific reasons for rejections, but a practical one. The next two I have highlighted in gray, the reason being that these are criteria for rejections for a selective journal, not for a sound science journal, because for the differences, simply because of the differences that I mentioned. So a selective journal will reject a paper if it is perceived as a little significance or if the research is incremental. We have a question?
Yes, there's a question, how do you know which is a sound science and which is a selective journal?
It'll be fairly, so in the journals, about the journal tab, every journal does it different. There has to be aims and scopes and overview of the journal. Most of the journals will provide their evaluation criteria. They should have a section where they say how the papers are evaluated and what criteria is used. And most often than not, sound science journals will explicitly mention that novelty or perceived impact is not the criteria, instead technical or scientific rigor is. On the other hand, in the case of selective journals, you will easily see words like novel, advancement, breakthrough, all those words. So it'll be fairly easy to know whether a journal is sound science or selective if you just go through their guidelines where they mention how they, first of all, what is their scope? They mention what is their scope and how they evaluate papers.
Thank you. There are other questions, but I'll save them. Don't worry, everybody, your questions will get asked. I'll save them for later.
And manuscript, of course, the easiest way to get rejected, the fastest, is actually having problems with ethical issues. And these include plagiarism, as we already discussed, missing ethical approvals, no consents present, and multiple submissions. The last one, though, is very difficult to detect and figure out. I've had instances where it sort of pops up mostly through reviewers. Believe it or not, the reviewer pointed it to me that they have received the same publication for review from another journal. But these are hard ones to spot. Again, it goes all on the honor system. We believe the authors when they say they have not submitted it at multiple locations. But still, if it obviously comes to our notice, that is an outright rejection. But the first two are obviously something that we can police, something that we can figure out. I did want to discuss a little bit about plagiarism because it has a few nuances associated with it. There are different shades of plagiarism. Something called as unintentional plagiarism and intentional plagiarism. And we want to avoid plagiarism in all forms, but most of the journals may be forgiving if it is unintentional plagiarism. That mostly happens if there is too much referencing to a paper that is very closely related or an inspiration for the present study. And so inadvertently, you end up having a lot of overlap of the original text from that previous publication. So that's mostly what we classify as unintentional plagiarism. But in that, what is important is, and how we detect it as unintentional, the results section does not have any overlap. The results section is completely new. There is no overlap. So most of the overlap is actually in the material method section. And sometimes that's actually authors' own previous publications as well. So that's all unintentional plagiarism, which of course, most of the journals will give an opportunity to the authors to fix. What is zero tolerance policy is towards intentional plagiarism, where you are claiming a study to be your own when it was really cut, copy, paste, or even inspired completely from something that was previously done, so much so that even the results sections overlap with just a few numerical differences in the values. That is intentional plagiarism, which of course is just like an outright reject, and we don't even bother to sort of ask the authors about it. So assuming that the editorial triaging we have passed the editorial evaluation, the next step is the peer review process. It's very important for the authors to understand what the peer review should be and should not be. By its purest of definitions, it is just the critical assessment of manuscripts that are submitted to journals by experts who are not part of the editorial staff. So they have to be external reviewers. What a peer review process should do, and ideally should be constructive, is to filter out the scientifically flawed studies, provide authors of feedback on the structure, presentation, study design, and scientific rigor, and make sure that the results are interpreted correctly, not exaggerated, and they're convincing. And overall, the goal being to improve the quality of the publication. And most editors hope that the reviewers can provide a constructive feedback instead of a one-liner that this study doesn't deserve to be published. So this is what a review process should do. What we confuse with and what a peer review process cannot do is detect fabrication. Reviewers can raise red flags if they feel that there is something sketchy about some data, but they are not supposed to do that. They're not policing the authenticity of the data that has been presented. So automatically, peer review cannot detect fabrication. It cannot prevent duplicate publication. You can't expect a reviewer or an editor to know each and every paper published in that field forever. So it can be raised red flags, but again, we cannot prevent it just by peer review, and that is again. And then the last 2 points, that ensuring that the article is right for the journal and is interesting is all that is now termed as perceived impact. Peer review should only improve the science of the paper. It cannot determine the impact, or it cannot determine how it will be received by the community. And then finally, it cannot definitely measure the impact. So all these last 3 things are perceived impacts. That a paper has been published does not mean it's impactful.
There's a question about the intentional plagiarism. How often, in your experience, have you detected that?
In my experience, it's about, thankfully, fortunately, it's low. It's about 2 to 3%, but it still exists. Most of the so original research articles, of course, that there is a no-brainer, but review articles suffer heavily from plagiarism, and there you cannot distinguish, you cannot differentiate that this is unintentional and this is intentional, because it's a review article. So most of the plagiarism that I have experienced are like essentially review articles, and just 2 or 3% were intentional plagiarism. Unintentional plagiarism is quite a lot. It's about 20-25%. And that's, again, mostly something that can be fixed, and we usually work with the authors to have it fixed.
Yeah, I've seen that papers get sent back by editors having been run through a similarity check and said it's too high. I mean, it's not getting rejected, I think, at that point, but they're giving the authors a chance to reword things and come back
Yes.
with more original content, text.
Yeah, we usually send the report to them so that it becomes easier for them to understand where the overlap exists. So this slide is just showing more than, I just wanted to highlight something that I think authors never use completely, is how the reviewers are chosen. So of course, the editor uses their own knowledge and experience and network and so on and so forth to find reviewers. They use Google, they use Medline, every available reviewer database, Publons, to find a reviewer. However, many journals also give you the choice to provide your own recommendations. And those are the author recommended reviewers. In my experience and in conversations with the other editors, this feature of the journals is more often than not, is not completely used by the authors, because they just don't, if a journal is asking for author recommendations, they mean it. They're not having it for fun. If you give reasonable recommendations, not all, but at least one may be used. The problem here lies is that most of the author recommendations are either of colleagues, collaborators, or co-authors in the last 5 years, or someone in the same institute, all of which are just directly just editor just cannot use them. So this is one thing that when you are preparing your manuscript and submitting it, maybe having reasonable recommendations where you think this person can be a good reviewer for your paper. Give it a serious thought. Don't just decide it on the day you're ready to submit your paper and emailing your PI what names I should add to this. So you should give it a serious thought, which I think is underutilized, this feature. And then, of course, this is also important because you need to prepare your manuscript and sort of make it compliant, depending upon which journal you have chosen and what is the review model that paper is following. The traditional ones, which I'm sure all of us know, is single blind and double blind, where the identity of the reviewer or the author or the both are not known. And then, of course, the more innovative ones that are now taking over is open peer review, where it's the best example for transparency, where the author knows who's a reviewer. Reviewers, of course, know who the authors are. And in the post-publication, this is a new one again. F1000 is one of the best examples where it's mostly post-publication. And this post-publication peer review models emerge from that concept of perceived impact. The thought process that a single editor and 2 or 3 reviewers cannot determine and should not determine the impact of and the interest for a paper in a community. So all these different innovative models stem from the problems, the systemic problems that exist in the research environment today. So all good. Hopefully now we have selected a journal. We have read the guidelines. Yes.
So a couple more questions. What about studies that are replication studies that you're trying to just replicate existing publications? Does that count as any type of overlap or plagiarism, or how do you handle that?
So yes, so they come under replication studies. Sound science journals definitely deal with them. They invite replication studies. Some of the selective journals too. The thing to keep in mind with replication studies is the rationale. Why did you replicate the study? I think that is important. You should, if that rationale exists, that why was there a need to replicate the study, then it will not come under plagiarism. If you are properly referencing the original study that was performed, you are acknowledging that this paper has been, this hypothesis has been tested before, and then you are giving the reason for the need to redo it, which could be under a project, for example, a reproducibility project. You are a part of a reproducibility project where you are trying to evaluate factors that affect reproducibility, right? So that's one reason where there was a need to replicate an existing study, or you want to build on a hypothesis that has been previously published, but now you want to use it as a springboard for a bigger, better project and study. But then you want to make sure that that initial hypothesis is true. And that is why you wanted to make sure you replicate it so that now you can expand it. So as long as you have those very valid scientific reasons for repeating the study, and you have proper attributes to the previously published study, and your text is not completely overlapping with whatever has been published, it should not be considered as plagiarism.
Thank you. And there's 2 more questions. Do you recommend, paying for budgeting and paying for the gold open access? Is that important and worthy? And also, why do journals charge for publication?
Okay.
Since most things are digital these days.
So, all right. So I can take the first question, that journals do not budget APCs within, we don't have budgets for APCs as in to accommodate or to pay on behalf of the authors. What we do have are waivers and schemes and discounts for countries that are either falling under developing or underdeveloped nations. So for those countries, researchers from those countries, definitely we have waivers and discounts in place to help them publish their research. Also, every journal has a few editorial waivers. That is totally on the discretion of the editor, essentially, if who they want to grant it to and not. The second thing is, why do we charge for the APCs? Why do we charge at all? Well, it may not appear so, but there are a lot of background processes happening from the time you're submitting till the time you are getting published that is being managed by the journal. Creating a platform for you so that you can submit your manuscript online instead of posting it. Maintaining those systems to make sure that the authors are able to view the status of their paper, for instance. Editors for devoting their time and efforts. So it's a job, right? So you are making sure that you are gating the journal. You're making sure that the journal is using the proper protocols in place, managing the peer review process. Yes, the peer reviewers, the biggest question is you're not paying the peer reviewers, and they are the ones who are actually doing the major bulk of the work. I agree, peer reviewers are instrumental and central to the whole process. And this is, I would agree, they are doing more like it as a community service, because their paper is also being reviewed by someone. And there are a lot of initiatives that are now being worked upon to make sure the reviewers get more credit for what they're doing. But apart from just that the peer review process, that's not the only thing that happens when a paper is being published, even if it is being online. Once your paper is getting accepted, you have a whole staff, a journal staff that's working on the paper for its copy editing, for its typesetting, for production, to make sure it's published online, for hosting platforms. So even if it's online, you have websites, you have platforms that are hosting your research. So all that takes maintenance and it makes developments. So and that requires cost. So that sort of explains why we charge. Who we charge is sort of different.
And then the question about the open review where the authors and reviewers are known. Why do you, what you call it, innovative? Can you just spend 30 seconds talking about why you think that's a huge advantage? Because somebody's saying that they see the disadvantages of that being even more.
No peer review model is free of any disadvantage. Every peer review has its own disadvantage. It really depends upon what the author's choice is. In the innovative peer review model, the transparent peer review model, I think it's the biggest disadvantage for that is sometimes you may not have an honest opinion from the reviewer. So that's the disadvantage. The advantage is that you know why your paper was rejected or why your paper was accepted. And so does the community knows that why this, what kind of review process this paper went through. In the case of post-publication models, the disadvantage is that it's difficult to police the comments, right? Anyone is free to comment anyway, which can be anything. So, but the biggest advantage is that you are not being judged by just 2 or 3 editorial staff members and peer reviewers to determine the impact of your paper. So again, and no, I don't think so any peer review model is just advantages or full of disadvantages. They have their pros and cons. So moving into the manuscript preparation, the biggest thing is where to start. Obviously, now we are actually getting into how to prepare your manuscripts, how to start with it. So different people have different ways. There are n number of places to start with. You can start with your abstracts, you can start with your introduction. And this is the time for a second poll question, like where do you start your paper with? What do you think is the best starting point to begin a research paper?
So the poll is open. Please let us know what's the first section that you would write. interesting. Keep going. We have 80% have voted. %. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay. Here we are. Methods.
All right. Methods is the winner. Okay. So again, this is again very personal choice, I would say. I usually, and the order of writing, reviewing different parts of paper is not set in stone. For instance, for me as an author, I always start with figures and tables. And my logic for that is it helps me build my story. It helps me understand the logical flow of events. And that's my take. I'm sure there will be another reason for the method section. The methods are the, I would say, if you have designed your study right, are perhaps the easiest sections to write and also to gain momentum. Like now you're writing your paper, you're getting in the groove. So I can see that writing methods is a good starting point. But really, when you want to start with the preparation of your manuscript, I think figuring out the story you want to present is very important, and the logical flow. And that is and also making sure that the why of the story, why was it done? What was the need to do it is also clear. So I think figures and tables and introductions are very, very play an important part in answering those questions. Of course, as an editor, it's sort of a reverse. Editors, the first thing they look at is the title, abstracts, and then figures and tables. And for reviewers, of course, they look at it more in a traditional style as the paper is written: introduction, methods, results, figures, and tables. However, no matter what you choose to begin with, there are some tips and best practices for each section. And the first thing that we will start with is title and an abstract. These are your first impressions. So title and abstract is the first thing an editor will look at. And this is the time when you want to sell your paper. And this is also the reason why title and abstract was one of the last things I had given in my list that I would write. Because by that time, you have written the whole story. You have lived through that whole journey. And now you know what is that one single message? What are the key findings? What is that X factor, then the selling point in your study? And that is what the title and abstract should capture. You have to keep your title, no matter how complex, how convoluted your study is, your title has to be simple and specific. That one take-home message you want to give to the editor and the reviewers. That should be your title. Abstracts, we cannot and should not cram it with details. And for anything, we should not keep it in suspense. We don't want to keep it suspense so that the editor will now read the paper to find out what happened. It's not a murder mystery, so we don't want to keep a suspense in our abstract. We want to tell them what happened, how it happened. And that means that the abstract should be sort of like structured in a way that you have a clear background, which gives you a brief overview of why the study was performed, what was the background gap that existed that prompted you to do the study, and therefore what are the objectives that are being addressed in the study, how they are being addressed by a short overview of the methods, and the main findings as results, and the final 1 or 2 sentence conclusion. This should capture the essence of your entire paper and should be attractive enough for the editor to proceed forward with the peer review process. At this point, I think we have another short activity for the abstract, in which we will just give you like a 5-minute read of 2 abstracts followed by just 1 question.
Okay, so I'm going to put into the chat box a document. Everybody should be able to access it from the chat. And you open the the document, read the two versions of the abstract. And then, which tell us, we'll have a poll afterwards. So we'll give you 5 minutes to read the abstract, and then I'll launch the poll. So at 4:30, the poll will get launched. I'm going to launch the poll now, and if you're done, you can respond to the poll. Take your time. Okay, we'll give one more minute. We have about 54% of the people who have voted, so choose your favorite abstract between the two and okay. All right. If you haven't had a chance, please vote. And I'm going to close the poll. All right, here we go.
Great. I mean, so that is good. So abstract 2 definitely was more clear because it was presenting the problem, especially for someone who might not be necessarily a natural product person or even in cancer therapy. So someone I noticed in the chat mentioned is that the abstract 1 doesn't necessarily give you the necessary background. It doesn't even touch upon the problem that exists, the gap in knowledge and gaps in knowledge that exist and what this study is trying to achieve. So this was just like a short activity to show that how the same study can be presented in 2 different ways. And this is what an editor will first read. And if you are not clear in your messaging in the abstract of all you know, your study will never be the beef of your study will never be studied. It'll just be rejected. So abstracts do play a very important part in crossing that editorial assessment and preventing triage. So we just want to move into the introduction now. In the introduction section, again, a funnel approach is what should be used, where eventually you start giving a broad overview of the field, narrowing it down to what are the gaps that exist in that field, and then finally, which of those gaps or what exactly are you trying to address in this study that will either progress the field or change the direction of the field or even like just confirm something that was in controversy, for instance. So an effective introduction leads to a logical progression of why the study was conducted. If after reading your introduction, someone who is not aware of what you're doing, doesn't understand why the study was performed and what necessarily it's trying to do, then basically it defeats the whole purpose and you stand a good chance of getting essentially rejected because that true weightage, that true value will not be recognized for your study. So you have to definitely cover what's already known in the area. What is the background? What was the motivation? And the rationale for the study and what is not known. And at the end of it, are the questions that you're seeking to answer in this research study identified? So these are the main points that you want to make sure you cover and not beat around the bush, trying to just capture as much of recent literature as possible. Instead, you should have a story to tell in the introduction. It should be a good preface for your results and methods. So it should end in a high note where someone now understands what's the problem and what are they trying to address. The next section, which I think I want to devote a little bit extra time on, is the materials and methods section. The reason is that of all the different sections and parts of a manuscript, the editors and reviewers' expectations for this section have undergone significant changes and changes that actually trace back to the inception and execution of the study. So for long, material methods section, as in the poll also we saw that is something that was considered to be the easiest to write with, a good starting point for your papers. And often it is also thought that no one reads it. So for the longest of the times, they were ignored section of the manuscripts, but now that is changing. And the driving force for that change is scientific rigor, or rather the lack of scientific rigor and reproducibility in scientific research, and increasing push for more transparency and for more access to published research and published data. So these are the two driving forces that have not only changed the expectations of the material method section of a manuscript, but have also ushered in what is known as open science. We are not discussing open science in detail in this presentation, only to let you know that it has different elements. Open access is one of them. Open data, open publishing practices, open collaboration, open recognition and reward, each having its own details, each taking its own time. But for the purpose of today and for the purpose of manuscript preparation, open data and open publishing practices are sparking discussions and initiatives to improve not just how research is reported and published, but also how research is designed and performed. I just want to quickly go back to what is exactly open publishing practices and open data. So in open publishing practices, the whole motivation is to increase the transparency and reproducibility of the research processes and the published product. And open data sort of complements it because it enables verification of the data, methodology, and reporting standards that allows others to reproduce and build on this. All right. So moving on, just keep in mind that the changes that are now being demanded and expected by editors and reviewers in the methods section are mostly motivated by these driving forces of open data and open publishing practices. And as a result, now the expectations are that the methods section must provide details, which often were lacking and even still are in majority of the publications that we read. They still lack the details of how the study was conducted, enough details for someone to actually replicate the study. And so it's almost like a cookbook, right? Like almost like the analogies are with a cookery show, like a cooking show, where you want the details to really recreate the dish. So what goes into the method section? What kind of details are the editors and reviewers expecting? They're expecting experimental design details, how all the procedures were conducted, details about the experimental subjects, how they were chosen, the criteria for including and excluding certain subjects, the controls, the groups, how they were determined, the replicates, how many technical replicates, how many biological replicates, these very intricate details that so often you will not actually find in a traditional original article. Materials, so much so that you want to identify, you want to make sure that those materials, if someone wants to buy them, has enough information to ID them. What is the source of that material, the catalog number, cell lines. If you're using cell lines, more and more journals are now demanding that you not only provide the source of the cell line, but also provide how you made sure that the cell lines are what they call, what you're saying they are. How did you authenticate the cell line? So they're asking details about cell line authentication, for instance. So such granular level details are now being demanded by good journals in the method section. And statistical analysis is gaining momentum, which increasingly emphasizes the importance of having a statistician on your team, so that statistical analysis is not just done in the end to somehow figure out that the results are significant. So just try all the tests possible, and whichever is giving you a p-value of less than 0.05, that's it. That's a statistical test. No, those are the days that are gone. Now you want to be proactive. Even before you know your results, you should know what statistical analysis you wanted to perform. And then finally, ethical approvals and written informed consent. While these are expected, again, as we mentioned that this has to be dealt with much before in your research cycle. It has to be dealt with even at the point when you're designing and performing your robust research study. So the expectations of adding more details in methods and your material section actually boils down or actually goes back into the time where you need attention in this right at the stage of designing your study. So now, and that is why you have to be aware of these reporting guidelines, even as you're performing your studies. You should have a well-reasoned hypothesis, unbiased, scientifically rigorous study design and statistical analysis. Now, this is not, I'm not talking this about writing your paper. This is when you're designing your study. It's only when you do implement all these things at the level of actually designing your study and experiments, can you actually report it in a better way when you're writing your paper. Your experimental subjects, again, the blinding methods, the data points you want to capture, what are the variables you want to consider, including biological and technical areas, sample size. How do you determine what is the right sample size for your study? What are the statistical assumptions you are making? Very overwhelming indeed. If you look at it, I will not deny it. This is very, very overwhelming, but if done properly, they constitute what is called a robust research study with better results and more reliable results, so to speak. And again, being aware of these guidelines, the international standard guidelines like ARRIVE, which have set guidelines most journals now demand when you're doing animal research studies, if you have adhered to those guidelines. And similarly, similar guidelines for reporting clinical trials and so on and so forth. So every discipline, every field has its own set of guidelines. And that is why identifying your journals and going through these guidelines, I cannot emphasize it enough, is important. We do, while we cannot touch upon every aspect of an experimental design, some of the important things that I do want to bring out is randomization and blindings, which so often are not really discussed, not even thought about in majority of the experiments that are planned. How did you randomize your subjects in different groups? Was any kind of blinding method used? So blinding in pure simple words, as the name suggests, is the experiment. The person who's performing the experiment is not aware of the experimental condition. And on the other side is a randomization, that how you distributed, how were different subjects, different units assigned to different groups. And these two factors, these two protocols, blinding protocols and randomization protocols, are more important in confirmatory research. More than it's nice to have them even in exploratory research, but even actually critical to have them in confirmatory research, where studies that cannot be repeated for ethical reasons or for studies that are limited in resources, they cannot be repeated. They are just one-time studies. This blinding and randomization protocols becomes even more important. And the best example that we have are the coronavirus vaccines as we speak. We wanted to make sure that these randomization and blinding protocols in those trials are robust enough for us to trust in those vaccines, correct? So this is what is a good example to show the relevance and the significance of these protocols right at the stage of designing your experiments. I also want to touch a little bit about the biological and technical variables, which so often are actually neglected. Biological variables include the gender, males, females, age factor, litter, cell lines, passage number in the cell lines, right? The source, just you saying it's MB231 cells, may be different from Professor Y's lab than from Professor X's lab. So it really differs in that. Species, strains, technical variables, which I think are harder to control, but still important to at least be aware of, and if possible, to sort of at least acknowledge them and control them. Gauge, experiment, machines, so on and so forth. So just a few examples. Again, this is very overwhelming. I'm not saying it's easy to sort of incorporate in the kind of research environment we are in, but it is always nice to at least acknowledge and be aware of them, and probably have a good team put together who can cover most of them. statistical sections are now gaining importance. It's not just enough to say t-test, pair t-test was used to compare groups and all values are expressed as mean and standard error. That was a typical, and the software that was used to do the statistical analysis. A classical research paper has just these three things listed. It's moving beyond that now. Good journals are now demanding how the power analysis was performed, how did you determine the sample size, what were the inclusion exclusion criteria that you used, justification for any kind of statistical interference, assumptions. Did you take into consideration normal distribution, or just did you assume it, or did you test it? Explanations of how the data will be presented. And this is something which is not easy, but now is being appreciated even more. Possibly a link to a data for the reviewers and editor verification. This is not mandated by most journals as of now, but they're highly appreciated if the authors are up and front with their data. And that sort of brings to the increasing momentum that is being felt for data sharing. Increasingly, you will hear about something called as fair data, where you want to make sure that a researcher, if a researcher wants to have access to data for a research paper, it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that applies to raw data, process data, softwares, protocols, etc. And this is, again, as I said, appreciated by the editors because it really helps them to evaluate your research. Most of the funders are now mandating authors to do this. Promoting research, and the biggest push is actually to promote reproducibility in research. This is a very big problem, and sharing data is one of the ways to sort of overcome it and increase reproducibility. And so now most of the journal editors and publishers are encouraging authors to share their data. Some are even mandating them to share their data. So many Wiley journals, for instance, have authors publish a data statement, which sort of makes the authors acknowledge how their data is being shared, and if they are not sharing the data, why they are not sharing their data. And then publishers like Wiley and certain journals are partnering with data deposition, the repositories like Figshare, Center for Open Science, and Dryad to sponsor the data publication charges. So not article publication charges, but yes, certain journals in Wiley are sponsoring the data publication charges for their authors. And then finally adopting very valid, legitimate data citation policies. So all these are the things that are changing and moving very fast, and boils down to having a very robust experimental design and being transparent with your data. That's the bottom line. So moving on now, obviously we are very tired of materials and method sections. Now who has time for results, right? But yes, we do need to write our results. Now results, after all that meticulous material methods, sounds fairly easy now. Where you need to organize your results in a logical order. It may not be the chronological order, but it has to be the logical order in a stepwise manner. These are some basics, which I'm sure most of you already know, that each result should have its own heading. It should clearly summarize the findings that you want to present. And the text should complement the figures and tables, but not repeat the same information in both of the things. And presenting the key results without interpreting their meaning. Interpretations are part of discussions, not part of results. And then, of course, now when you're presenting your results, it is expected that you will report descriptive statistics. You will quantify all your statements, more or less. It doesn't apply anymore. You have to quantify the fold differences. If you are calling, what is the size effect, right? So you have to quantify your differences. Reporting the statistics, the degrees of freedoms, test values, as many details you can add, the better your chances of getting published. Result sections should be, but above all, should be written with accuracy, brevity, and clarity, but not so concise that the reader is now expected to find find the trends that you're trying to tell them. So there is a fine balance between being accurate and being incomplete. In the last 10 minutes, I want to quickly, in the next 5 minutes, actually, I want to cover figures and tables. This, I think, is pretty standard information that as we have already touched, it should complement the results. They should be self-explanatory. A reader or an editor should not feel the need to refer to the text in your results section to understand your figures. It should be self-explanatory. There should not be too many data points. You should choose your scale wisely. If there are images, then they should be of good resolution. And you should please don't forget to refer to your figures in the text. And that's something that happens fairly often. And the title of the this is like small thing, that the title of the table should be at the top and the title of the figure should be at the bottom. What is more important right now, which I want to discuss here, is how to present your data, graphical representation of your data, and how that is rapidly and very quickly changing. Bar graphs for the longest period of the time were the accepted standards, and you still see a lot of bar graphs in most of the original research articles. However, it is now being increasingly recognized how they are misleading. As you can see in this example here, the actual data points are only centered on the top side of the bar. And you can see the y-axis here actually ends even below the last data point here. So you can see that if in a figure, this bar graph is truly misleading because the data points, there is a zone of irrelevance. There are no data points in this zone. And there is a zone of invisibility where you had data points, but a reviewer or an editor or any reader cannot appreciate that there were recordings of data in this zone of invisibility. So an ideal way of representing this would be a box plot or scatter plot that shows the actual distribution of the data points on the graph as opposed to a bar graph. And you can appreciate it more by this example where how different data sets, 4 different data sets will actually end up producing the same bar graph. However, all 4, as you can see, will have very different conclusions. So this is now being increasingly recognized by editors, by publishers, that it is very important to represent your data in a transparent way, transparent visualization of your data. And more bar graphs are being discouraged. Instead, scatter plots, box plots, and so on and so forth, which show the distribution of your data points are gaining momentum and are actually more pleasing to the editors and the reviewers. The final point, the closing thing is discussion, right? But the discussion, again, should never be neglected just because it comes in the last. It should be concise information, but it should focus on important points and unexpected results, even if they're negative results. It should still focus on the unexpected results, not on small details. This is where all your interpretation should happen and scientific speculation should happen. You should always discuss what is and not what if. And provide answers. What answers were provided whatever you were testing, were you able to answer that? Do the findings agree with what others have shown? What is a new understanding? What is the progress that has been made? And what is the next logical step as a result of your study? All these things should be captured in discussion section. And do the authors consider how the results of other studies may be combined to derive a new or perhaps a better substantiated research study to understand the problem? Discussion is a place where the authors can provide their opinion, but at the same time, not over speculate, and also put their results in perspective of what is known in the literature. And above all, you should never overinterpret and never say you had the perfect study. I'm sure every study has a limitation. It's always nice to acknowledge those limitations for the readers and for the editors. And absolutely no new results should be discussed in the discussion, especially if you know, unpublished studies. We know I did this in my lab, and so I know this happens. So no new results should be presented in the discussion section. Finally, one of the last slides is a revision decision. You submitted your paper, you passed the editorial assessment, peer reviews got back to you, and the revision decision has been given to you. It's often the day when there is chaos in the lab, chaos at home, because you have got reports, you are angry with the reviewers, sometimes you're angry with the editor. The best thing is to be calm and look and read the reviews. Sometimes reviewers are harsh, sometimes reviewers are rude. Try to overlook that, try to read the science, try to see if what scientific facts are the reviewers saying. You have to carefully consider the referee comments. Not all changes have to be made. This is one thing that the authors need to understand. You are not mandated to address every reviewer comment, and the editors are fully aware of that. However, you should give a scientific reason for not being convinced by the reviewer comments and why you think that reviewer comment does not require any addressing in this present study. And once you have done that, once you've analyzed that, and when you're preparing your revision, please highlight the changes that you have done in your manuscript. You need to provide a point-by-point response to reviewers' criticism that should go beyond the one single word done. You have a reviewer comment, and below that, the reviewer response is done. That's not acceptable. You have to mention how it was done, what you have addressed, and where have you addressed. So this is something that most of the authors sometimes do not pay enough attention to, the point-by-point response letters, which more often than not are read by the editors. So it's helpful to give a summary and your perspective. And sometimes they even go back to the reviewers. If a reviewer is rude to you, try not to be rude in return. Try to be polite in return. Be the bigger person. And again, you have to understand that peer review process is not a private conversation between authors and referees. Try to work your answers and work with the editor to revise your papers. I'm not sure if we have time for this was something that I just kept in case we have time, but I can just simply say that I just wanted to point out a new article type called registered reports to everyone, which is basically emphasizes the importance of research questions and methods. So here you have two stages of publication, stage 1 and stage 2. In stage 1, it is just the hypothesis and just the materials and methods in your study design. And that is peer reviewed by the journal. And once that is accepted, the authors then proceed to performing their experiments. And in stage 2, they publish their results, which looks more like a traditional original article. And the reason why registered reports have been promoted by the Center for Open Science is mostly to reinstate greater credit for the why and how of a scientific study versus what was its outcome and versus what was its perceived impact. So sort of promoting scientific rigor over and above just positive results. So that was the whole point. And then, of course, this was something in cancer biology, and I think in neuroscience as well. Many studies that were published in high impact journals were never reproducible, not because there was fraud and not because there was fabrication, but just because there was a weakness in the study design, not taking into consideration so many variables and statistical assumptions that we just talked about. And registered report is basically focused on overcoming those problems of having a rational hypothesis and a robust experimental design, trying to be inclusive and detailed reporting of methods and results, and giving them more importance over the direction of the research finding, whether you were able to cure cancer or not. So it was like, how did you try? And then, of course, statistical competency. And so that sort of brings us to the last slide, which is essentially my first slide. I hope most of you have been able to appreciate some of these terms in this word cloud that have increasing impact on our manuscript publication and preparation. And in the end, I just want to quickly call for, we are looking in my journal, Cancer Reports, we are looking to expand our editorial board, and we are looking to have an early career researcher reviewer boards. And so we are inviting applications, mostly resumes of interested candidates who are interested in scientific publications. Please get in touch with me, especially if you have experience in statistics, clinical oncology, or cancer biology. And if you're interested in joining our review board and gain experience in scientific publication, my contact information is here. Please get in touch with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. This was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate Nidhi and I went back and forth a couple times on the slides and the content, but I think she really hit the nail on the head in terms of giving us insight into the new trends in publishing and editorial review. And for those of you who have to leave, you can leave, but if you asked a question and it didn't get answered, Nidhi, would you be willing to stay around for 5 or so minutes to answer a few questions?
Definitely, I can.
Okay, great. So one question Joseph asked is, if you get, as an editor, 2 constructive reviews and a 3rd reviewer that just trashes the paper, how as an editor do you deal with that? And more importantly, how do you advise an author to handle that?
So I've had a lot of such cases where reviewers give conflicting opinions or reports. As an editor, I cannot speak for all the editors, but I can definitely tell you what I do. I read obviously both the reports. I have read the paper myself, so I have my own version of the report as well. I definitely, if it's, be it a good report or a bad report, I do not consider it if it is not a constructive report. So if the good report says it is a very well done study, excellent, publish it, I am probably not going to consider it much because the reviewer has not given me details of what the reviewer feels is robust, what the reviewer feels is a plus point. And honestly, a one-line review is not like, it doesn't give me convincing evidence that it was thoroughly reviewed. On the other hand, on the similar grounds, if it's a bad report and it just says this article cannot be published, and I think I read the comment, which Joseph, I think, said that this is trash, is the word that was used. I will not consider that bad report as well. So I think the important point is how detailed and how constructive that report is. And in which case, I will always give the authors the opportunity to address those comments. I definitely, for one, and I don't think so most editors do that, they most oftenly give the authors an opportunity if the editor is using their own power to evaluate. See, you have to understand there are different journals, different editors operate in different ways. Some editors, they just go by, they play the safe side, where they receive one bad comment, they make it as a basis to reject it because they just don't want to get into it. However, I would say a good review process involves a good intervention from the editor. So for me, I read both the reports. If the bad report has given me very scientifically flawed red flag kind of reasons to reject it, then I reject it. But if they just think that it's perceived impact is what is the reason, I then sort of give the authors an opportunity to address it.
Thank you.
Okay. If you were writing a review, which section would you start with? How would you approach it?
For writing a review, I would actually first start with a workflow. I would a process, a flow chart, not a workflow, a flow chart. So for a review article, it requires a lot of pre-work. A review article is not something that you just start writing as you read your papers. A review article requires, I would say, if you're a postdoc, at least a year's worth reading. to even understand the problem and understand the depth of the topic that you want to review on. And so for me, it would involve a chronological order of reading the papers and how the research on that topic has evolved. So review article, believe it or not, is more difficult than a research article. So for me, I would always start with the chronological flow of events, which I don't advocate for original research articles, but for review articles, I would just go with the chronological order flow of events. I would start with the background, of course, the traditional way, because in that I would like to capture the focus of the review. Reviews are tricky ones. You can easily lose focus.
Mhm.
So I would think about the topic and I would think about the background to focus myself on it. So I would always start with the background.
It's interesting. I'm having one of my students is writing a review article now, and I told her actually to come up with a hypothesis for the review in a way. Like I want her to stay focused. And if you have a hypothesis, like something that you're synthesizing, what is the message that you're trying to convey, and center it around that, even though it's not a research article. Another question was, how much detail do you recommend including of computational methods? Should you share the whole script if it's like a GitHub script or other Python
Links.
script? Yeah.
For algorithms, for codes, links are what is expected. So essentially and they're even more important. So just mentioning how those scripts can be accessed is good enough. I don't think so necessarily the journal platforms and the online submission systems are robust enough to handle those gigabytes of codes. So I think the links is what works for those.
Okay. Everybody's complimenting the talk and asking about the slides and the recording, which will be available. I will email out the recording link to those who registered for the meeting today and post it on the graduate school website. People know how to find me if they need something. So I think we talked about reviews. Did anything else not get covered that you guys had questions about? Feel free to unmute if you're still here and your question has not been answered.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
So even though authors answered all reviewers' requests and the editor said it's okay, but sometimes the reviewers may not agree with this kind of response. And then how the editor handled this situation?
So I would say, and I think I mentioned in one of the slides, reviewers should not make the decisions of acceptance or rejections for the journal. It should be the editor. And it is important for the authors to sort of select your journals accordingly, where you have an editor who is involved and has their own opinion, which may be different from the reviewers. So, and the reason why I say that is that the very fact that a manuscript has gone through the review process, it means that somewhere the editor believes this paper is appropriate for the journal, right? Given that the science is correct. A reviewer's job should be that, like what are the things that can be improved upon. The authors might have their own opinion, they might improve it in some capacity. The final decision should be of the editor. I have, in my experience, gone ahead and accepted papers that after revisions, reviewers felt are still not good enough. When I do that, I sort of email the authors the reasons why I went. I mean, of course, I'm giving good news to them that I'm accepting the paper, but I give them reasons why I have accepted and sort of vetoed the reviewer comments. And at the same time, I also email the reviewers. So this is, I think, the standard protocol, and this is what transparency is all about. That if I am using the services of the reviewers and they have spent their time to review it for me, and then I'm not sort of convinced or agreeing with their decision, the least I can do is at least explain to them and give the reason. So I do both ways. I give reasons when my opinion is different from the reviewers. The reverse has also happened. Reviewers say accepted, and I still have a problem and I have rejected them. So either way, as a good editor should be giving reasons for going against the reviewers' wishes to both the authors and the reviewers themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
One thing I can definitely say, appeals. Authors don't use them enough. If you have a situation where you have been rejected and you have very solid scientific reasons where you feel it should not have been rejected, write to the editors and write a rebuttal why you think so. Editors consider appeals.
And I know some selective journals actually, I don't know if this is still true, but would talk to an author before the submission and discuss the manuscript with them and work with them. If it's a really high impact study,
Yes.
work with them to help get it submitted properly and have the right review and tone and impact.
I agree. I mean, I think the conversation should be, you should maintain a communication channel with the editor. And you should be not to the point of trying to influence the editor, because obviously they will know it, but trying to gauge the interest of the editors and making sure that the tone is right so that you are given opportunities to revise.
And you did talk about the cover letter, which I think also
Yes.
helps frame why you think that this is an appropriate and important article for that journal.
Yes, and as I said, if a reviewer, if an editor has already sent it to review process, they definitely feel that it is publishable. They definitely feel it is a right fit for the journal. Otherwise, it would be a test reject. So after that, I think it's more important to work on the reviews. And I'll be honest, sometimes it's also like which editor you're dealing with. So some of the editors, and this is a hard fact. I mean, it's applicable to everywhere in the field. So it's just which editor you're dealing with. Some editors are more involved than the others.
April's asking about a career path to becoming an editor. And actually, April, we have on our iJobs website, we've had career panels with editors before. So I can direct you to that website, but maybe Nidhi can give a 1-minute summary of her recommendation for how you can get the experience other than volunteering for her, as she has shown here as a volunteer editor. But any suggestions on that career path?
Yes, I mean, if you want to become an editor, I would say networking is most important. Try to interact with others who are already in that industry to understand the industry, not necessarily to get a job, but to understand how it functions, what are the different roles in that industry, and then trying to decide if you are interested in it. I think gaining experience as a reviewer helps, because that helps you understand the publication process. Actually publishing yourself helps in understanding the process. Becoming members of the boards, as I have just posted, is another option. But more importantly, try to start thinking about it when you are in your, I think, 2nd or 3rd year of postdoc. Because at the end of it, when you appear for interviews, it's very important to explain why you want to enter it, so that it doesn't sound like you're trying to escape from academia, even if that might be true, but still. So I think I'm happy to talk to you on a separate at a separate occasion. We can get in touch with LinkedIn to guide you more on how we can transition successfully.
So I just posted 3 different events we've had, including Wiley, with podcasts. So you can listen to those career panels. 2 of them have podcasts, I think. 1 of them doesn't, but. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Bansal. This has been an amazing event, and I know everybody was benefiting from it. So I Thank you. And I'll send out the recording and slides to everybody. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.